Though many artists might first think of cliched images of perfectly posed and perpetually happy and productive model Soviet citizens when talking about Soviet photography, such was not the case during the early years of the USSR. Perhaps surprisingly, Soviet art, including photography, had a clear avant-garde tilt in the decade between the October Revolution and the first five-year plan.
It was characterized by an exceptional amount of experimentation in all of the arts, in photography, in film, which was photography in motion, in the plastic arts, in the visual arts, in architecture. This was a decade that witnessed an unprecedented amount of liberalism, which was supported and encouraged by the Bolsheviks for several reasons. The most important being that for the Bolsheviks, 1917 was meant to be a clear break, not only with Russian, but with bourgeois Western history. And they embrace the avant-garde in the arts, which had already developed by then, but they embrace it and support it financially because it ideologically fits their narrative of building a completely new world from scratch. What avant-garde begins to revolutionize in the very beginning of the 20th century is a move away from those traditional historical and religious subjects. And for the Bolsheviks, by the way, this fit their ideological direction perfectly because they were atheists, so they didn't want any biblical subjects on their canvases.
Among various art forms supported by the Bolsheviks, photography gained particular prominence during the experimental decade of 1920s. Leading photographers like Alexander Rodchenko, Arkady Shaikat, and Boris Ignatovich frequently used avant-garde techniques of unconventional composition, startling angles, high tonal contrast, extreme close-ups, and unorthodox light in their works.
Early Bolshevik culture is for the most part very visual in general because the population they inherit from the Russian Empire is overwhelmingly rural, about 82%, and overwhelmingly illiterate. So for the Bolsheviks to get their message out, they need to emphasize visual communication first and foremost with as little writing in it as possible. And so photography and film, propaganda posters, and even avant-garde art are thrown into this great battle for the hearts and minds of the Soviet people.
However, Lenin's death and Stalin's rise to power in the late 1920s and early 1930s brought profound changes to Soviet life, including the art scene.
Stalin presides at this time over the centralization and nationalization of the Soviet economy. This is part of the five-year plan, which is launched in 1928. A year before the Great Depression hits, which actually contributes to the popularity of the Soviet experiment. But parallel to the first five-year plan and the centralization of the Soviet economy, Stalin also presides over a very conservative turn in Soviet cultural and social sensibilities. The move away from the experimental arts of the 1920s to socialist realism is only part of that picture. In the 1920s in the Soviet Union, for example, abortions became legal. Marriage was facilitated to the point where people, because it became a civil, not a religious ceremony, women could divorce husbands by postcard. They were known as the famous postcard divorces. The nuclear family that Marx and Engels wrote was a spawn of bourgeois society, was actually discouraged in the 20s as collective raising of children and all sorts of experiments in the educational sphere dominated Soviet life. By the early 30s, Stalin reverses all of these things. Abortions are made illegal. The nuclear family is re-emphasized as the basic building block of Soviet society, along with the importance of the collective. All those crazy experiments with orchestras without conductors, because a conductor is a bourgeois leftover, that is gone by the wayside. Stalin reintroduces into the Bolshoi theater repertoire old Tsarist era operas, which he appreciates much more than all of that crazy musical experimentation which comes out in the 1920s. And with this, of course, comes the turn, the Hollywoodization of Soviet film in the 1930s. So this is a conservative turn away from the utopian experimentalist 20s to what the West would recognize as Western art with socialist content.
The doctrine arose, socialist realism, which had since been the official artistic principle of the Soviet Union, drove all Soviet art, including photography, in a starkly different direction from that of the experimental avant-garde 1920s.
It is very photographic. I mean, you can clearly recognize human beings, shapes, and it is focused on labor, productivity. It follows the ideological principles of the Soviet Union as a state which is founded on the friendship of the peasants and the workers. So socialist realism embraces a very photographic representation of society. The remarkable thing about socialist realism is that the world that it actually depicts, full of happy peasants during collectivization and happy workers, is really not an accurate depiction of Stalin's crash industrialization and the disastrous consequences of collectivization. So despite its title of realism, socialist realism is not terribly realistic. It should have really been called socialist idealism because it projected the world as it should have looked and as the Soviet leaders wanted it to look, not really the way it looked in the 1930s and 40s in the Soviet Union. Socialist realism became a form of art that Stalin accepted and promoted from 1932 on because he believed that all of that crazy abstract expressionism, all these triangles and lines, Kandinsky, Malevich, Chagall, Tatlin, what these guys were producing in the 20s was absolutely incomprehensible to the common people. And in a sense he was right, because modern art is not for everyone. It takes a lot of work, it takes effort to understand, to read, to decode, and it takes sophistication and a certain level of education. Now the Soviet Union in the 1920s launches a massive literacy promotion program, which is one of the great successes of the Soviet experiment. But by the 1930s, this is incomplete. And Stalin understands that what most Soviet citizens want by the 1930s is art that they can understand. And socialist realism is basically the traditional European bourgeois form of art that is updated for the 1930s in the Soviet Union, but completely cleansed of biblical and neoclassic, or classical rather, topics.
By the end of the second five-year plan in 1938, with the avant-garde techniques gone, so was the central creative premise behind early Soviet photography, that while belonging to a united working class, individual Soviet citizens and their lives were diverse, unique and beautiful on their own, and therefore worth celebrating and uplifting. Under the auspice of socialist realism, however, an orthodox, quote-unquote realistic approach to photography was established, and the collective, the leadership, the productivity of the Soviet populace, and the perfection of Soviet life became the central themes of Soviet photography until the 1980s.